On page 45 in the book, Karen asked me, what page are we on? And she said, wow, you're moving along, aren't you? Yeah, in about 45 years or so, we might get through the book. Well, we were talking about the limited nature of the law. And we noted that the law, talking about the law of Moses, was given only to the Israelites. Deuteronomy 5:2, that God made a covenant, he says, with us in Horeb. And then it was added because of transgression, Genesis 3:19. And we noted that it was added because of the promise, or it was added to the promise, and that promise would be the Abrahamic promise. And mentioned Genesis 3:16 through 18, which we'll go back to again this evening. And it was only added till, which again we'll notice this evening, until is a preposition that is a time marker, until the seed should come. And it mentions that that seed is Christ. But it was never designed to be a permanent law. It was instead a shadow of things, good things to come. The shadow is never real. The object that it reflects is that which is real. Well, the shadow was the law. That which is real is the New Testament and that system of Christianity and heaven. And obviously, when you see a shadow as opposed to that which is the object, the real is always greater than the shadow. If you see my shadow, there's really nothing there. That shadow actually can be blocked in a human standpoint, but there's no substance to the shadow. The substance is that which is real. Well, the real was the New Testament system. The shadow was the Old Testament system. Then we noted it was not given to the Gentiles, in Romans 2 and verse 14. But it was only to last, and this is where we ended, it was only to last until Christ came. In Galatians, the 3rd chapter, and verses 18 through verse 25. Wherefore then serveth the law? Now the law there is talking obviously about the law of Moses. In fact, I'll add that Galatians was written because of Judaizing teachers. And so when you see law mentioned in Galatians, same thing in relationship to Romans, it's almost invariably talking about the law of Moses. And that's what it is here. Wherefore then serveth the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come, to whom the promise was made. And it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Now a mediator is not a mediator of one, but God is one. Is the law then against the promises of God? God forbid. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, verily righteousness should have been by the law. But the Scripture hath concluded all under sin, that the promise by faith of Jesus Christ might be given to them that believe. But before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith, which should afterwards be revealed. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith has come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. If you look at verse 19, the law was given till the seed should come. And again, is that till or until is a time marker. It would be in effect until this certain time. The time that he sets forth is the seed promise, that one who is the seed. The seed would be, of course, Christ. In verse 23 through 25, those verses, before faith, and faith is representative of the Christian system, as opposed to law, which represented the law of Moses. Before faith, which should afterwards be revealed, or before faith came, we were kept under the law. Well, there would have been the Jews in reality, not Gentiles, but they were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith which should afterward be revealed. So the faith was going to come, that Christian dispensation, the Christian system, but until it came, they were kept under the law of Moses. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, and we've talked about that word schoolmaster before, but it bears repeating. It's the Greek word pedagogos. And as I've stated, there's really no English term that is equivalent to a pedagogos. King James uses schoolmaster, which is a bad translation. American Standard uses tutor, which is a bad translation. Just about every other one uses tutor as well. Again, bad translation. There's not a good translation of the word. So they were trying to do the best that they could in translation, when they should have, in this case, just transliterated the Greek term into English letters. And then it would have been, wherefore the law was our pedagogos. And we would scratch our heads and say, what's that? And then we'd have to go and study a little bit. Oh, that's a bad word, though. Study. We're not supposed to study, are we? Well, pedagogos was actually a servant, a very trusted servant in a master's house. He had the responsibility of the children, and he would take the children to the teacher. Schoolmaster is a teacher. That's why it's not a good translation. A tutor would be a teacher. Well, the pedagogos took them to the teacher. Now then, on the way, he was responsible for their safety. He was to teach them moral principles of the family, and thus to make sure that they were brought up properly in that sense. But that's what a pedagogos, schoolmaster, really was. Well, that was the law. The law of Moses was to take us to Christ. But the teacher was one who was a real schoolmaster, was the one who was responsible with teaching. He was only that one who was responsible to get them there properly, so that we might be justified by faith. After that faith has come, though, he says we're no longer under the schoolmaster, no longer under that pedagogos. Pedagogos has served its purpose. So the law was only for a specific period until Christ came. After Christ came, the law was done away with. And we'll see that more. But Christ came to fulfill the law. That's two L's, isn't it? In Matthew, the 5th chapter, and verse 17, He says, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. This word fulfill, some will say it means to fill full. Well, that doesn't help a whole lot, does it? Might as well say fulfill. Fill full. Well, either way. It actually is dealing with, it is to accomplish the purpose of a thing. To accomplish its purpose. Jesus fulfilled the law in that he accomplished its purpose in himself. That does not necessitate that every prophecy of the Old Testament had to be fulfilled by Christ or the time of Christ. He still, you have the purpose of the law. And he fulfilled its purpose. Not necessarily every prophecy. It has led to discussions that why the law is still in effect because there are certain prophecies of the Old Testament that haven't been fulfilled yet. Well, the problem is Christ still fulfilled the purpose of the law in bringing people to Christ. We'll notice in a few minutes the idea of the purpose of the law a little bit more. But he accomplished its purpose, and thus he was able to take it out of the way, to fulfill it. Let me mention the word in the King James, destroy the law. The word destroy. Later translations changed that word to abolish. They do us an injustice. Because in Ephesians, 2nd chapter, it says that Christ abolished the law. Now, if Jesus is saying, I did not come to abolish the law, and yet the law was abolished, he did something he said he was coming to do. It's contradiction. The word should be, as King James has it, destroy. You can abolish something without destroying it. Likewise, you can destroy something without abolishing it. If our Constitution of the United States, that original document, was taken and destroyed, would that mean that it's no longer effective? That we were no longer subject to it as a nation? I know a lot of people want to get us out of that, but it would still be in effect. It would not have been abolished simply by the destruction of it. The idea of destroying something is to treat it with disrespect. Christ had the greatest respect for the law. And by doing so, he fulfilled the law, its purpose, and thus was able to abolish it, even though it has not been destroyed in that sense. So he did not come to destroy the law. He did come to abolish the law. It is no longer in effect. We are no one is subject to it. And so he took it out of the way. And look at Colossians 2 and verse 14. blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. First, look at this word, took. He took it out of the way. It is and here for those, who still have that Greek tense paper that I gave everyone, it is a perfect tense verb. Perfect tense was a verbal action that was a past action or a completed action with continuing or abiding results. Thus, when Christ took it out of the way, completed that action, he took it out of the way permanently. Now, dispensational premillennialists, some of them at least, say that we're going to go back under the law of Moses when Christ comes to set up his earthly kingdom. Well, Paul says that law was essentially permanently taken out of the way. The cross was the perfect sacrifice, fulfilling the law and bringing it to a permanent end. The completed action of the cross and Christ's death upon it, the blood that he shed, brought it to an end, but also it permanently brought it to an end. It can never be restored. But from a technical aspect, Paul uses, and here again we're going to use that Greek paper, 3 aorist tense verbs. Now, the reason I bring this out is because there's an important aspect of this. An aorist tense is simply a completed action. These are participles showing what Christ has done. The first one is he blotted out. Second, he nailed it to the cross. And third, he spoiled principalities and powers. And that actually, I think, goes into the next verse. Having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. So that spoiled is that third aorist tense. Completed actions. He blotted it out. He nailed it to the cross. He spoiled principalities and powers. All completed. Now then, there's a contrast, though. And again, go back to took, being perfect tense. Stands in stark contrast to the aorist tense that he uses for blotted out, nailed it to the cross, spoiled principalities and powers. A strong contrast. Also, The idea of nailed it to the cross. While it is an aorist participle, it's also called and referred to as a modal participle. M-O-D-A-L. And that emphasizes the means by which the law was taken out of the way. Here's the way Christ took the law out of the way. How? By nailing it to the cross. So it's a very powerful statement showing the death of the law of Moses, that it did not continue, that these Jews were freed from that law. Why? So that the cross could become the source of forgiveness, of salvation, of freedom, of peace, something that the Judaizing teachers were going to take away by, let's go back to the law of Moses and let's bind the law of Moses upon Gentiles. And Peter said that that was a yoke which neither us nor our fathers were able to bear. Acts 15th chapter. Therefore, we're not under the law, but there's a new and living way. Hebrews 10 and verse 20. Paul says, by a new and living way which he hath consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. When he says through the veil, the reference actually goes back to when he dies upon the cross. What happens to the veil in the temple? It's torn asunder. While that veil was a separation between the most holy place and the holy place, that only the high priest could enter one time or one day a year, 2 different times on that day. Now then, it is torn asunder. That separation no longer exists. So you have the most holy place and the holy place. Now then, it's only one compartment. Now, in the holy place represents the church. The most holy place represents heaven, the dwelling place of God. And he says, now then, it's open. Here's this new and living way which Christ consecrated for us by ripping that veil in the temple in sunder, so we now have access to the very throne room of God himself. And he did that by his flesh, by dying upon the cross. So, just go over here. Which law is binding today? Well, first off, as our book points out, Jesus came to establish a better covenant. In Hebrews 7 and verse 22, Paul says, by so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. Here's one that's better. Better than what? Better than anything of the old covenant. And so it's a better testament, a better law, or a better covenant. Let me just kind of as an aside here bring out the point that in the Old Testament, we call it a testament because we have a greater understanding than they did. They never called it a testament, though. They always referred to it as a covenant. It was a covenant. Now, what's the difference between a testament and a covenant? Okay, that's really about the only difference, the death of the testator. Testament requires the death of someone. A covenant is simply an agreement or a pact between two, or more than two possibly, but between two. In this case, between God and the Israelites. They did not understand that it was going to be based upon the death of Christ, even though the sacrifices that they offered year by year, they realized they couldn't take away sin. They should have realized there's going to come someone who can take away sin by his death, and thus give us the forgiveness of sins as well. And so, while it was a testament, they only understood it as a covenant. Under the new covenant agreement or pact, we realize that the old and the new are based upon the death of Christ, and so they were both testaments. So when he says that Jesus was made a surety of a better testament, also the idea is covenant. That's the way they understood it, even though in reality it was based upon the death of the testator. But now then there's a better one, better than that old system. In Hebrews, the 8th chapter, and verses 6 through verse 8, he says, "But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." So he's obtained a better or more excellent ministry. He is a mediator of a better covenant, testament, established upon better promises. Great sermon would be the promises of God, because there's so many and varied. And he makes the comparison. If the first had been faultless, there wouldn't have been any reason to have a second. But notice, for finding fault with the law? No. For finding fault with them, the people. In what way? They could not keep it sinlessly. And there was no avenue for the forgiveness of sins under the Old Testament law by itself. It had to rely upon the death of a sinless sacrifice. Blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin, though. But because man sinned and the law could not forgive that sin, there was a need for the second, and that's the law of Christ. But the law was perfect for the intent or the purpose for which it was given. What is the purpose of the law? Well, I propose 4 reasons as far as the purpose of the law. I'll just put it as reveal sin. Now, if you wanted the entire idea, to define and highlight sin. Remember Paul's statement in Romans 7th chapter, I had not known lust except the law said, thou shalt not covet. Romans 7, I think that's verse 7. It revealed what sin was. The second purpose, and obviously all of these could be elaborated on a great deal more. It was to show man's inability to sinlessly keep the law. The 14th and 53rd Psalm, basically saying the same thing. I think there's one phrase difference. If memory serves me correct, 53 has an additional phrase in it. But it states that there is none righteous, no, not one. There's no man that's kept the law. It's basically what Paul concludes in Romans 3:23, for we have all sinned and come short of the glory of God. No one was able to keep the law. That's why, and I'm saying no one could sinlessly keep the law, that's why they had to offer sacrifice for their sins all the time. You know, probably millions and millions of gallons of blood that was shed upon the altar. Why? To take away their sin. And they couldn't do it. But why did they have to offer it? Because they realized they had committed sin. They needed forgiveness for the sin. So it showed that man was unable to sinlessly keep the law. And I'll just briefly mention we should not use the word perfect in relationship to sinless, because that's not what the word means in the Bible. We are to be perfect. If we're not being a Christian. Just one passage, Matthew 5:48, be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. There are many others that show the same principle. We are to be perfect. We better be perfect. That does not mean sinless. It never has, it never will, no matter how much it's abused by people today. We cannot be sinless, and thus we have someone who's there who can take away our sins. And thus, the third idea is to prepare the way for Christ. If I have sinned, and I have, and they sinned, and they realize their sin because God gave us the law of Moses, and it defined sin and what it is, and the blood of bulls and goats couldn't take away the sins. I need someone who can. And so the law, from its very inception, was setting forth preparing man for the coming of Christ and the need for the coming of Christ. And then a fourth reason to provide historical examples. Passage probably most all of us know, Romans 15:4, for the law was, and now I can't even quote it. Well, that's the problem. You quote these so often, and then when you need it, you can't think of it. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. Those things were written for our learning, for us, providing historical examples for us. And could preach several sermons on how that those four principles are seen throughout the Old Testament. And they work together to provide us that way of Christ. So the law was perfect for its intent, but it made no provision to remove sin. And we've already emphasized that, so we won't really go through again. The blood of bulls and goats could not take away sin, and yet that's what they had to offer. Made no provision for the removal of sin, even though the law revealed that they had sinned. That's why it was preparing for Christ, preparing the people for Christ, a sinless sacrifice. It was only thus a national and a temporary law. It was national in that it was only given to the children of Israel, and it was temporary in that it was designed to last a certain period of time and no longer. It was not adequate, our book points out, for a universal and a spiritual kingdom. The law of Christ, New Testament law, is a universal law. All men today are subject to the law of Christ. Whether they reject it or not doesn't make any difference. They're still subject to it. Living in the United States as we do, are we subject to the laws of the United States? A lot of people might not think so, but we are, aren't we? What if we say, I reject the laws of the United States? Does it really make any difference whether I reject them or not? I'm still subject to them. And cannot I be prosecuted if I violate those laws? Well, of course. And if I go before the judge and say, Judge, I reject the laws of the United States, I'm not subject to them, how far do you think I'll get? Well, you can watch, if you want to, on YouTube, some of these sovereign citizens. They have basically rejected at least part of the laws of the United States. They go before a judge and they start that nonsense, and they don't get very far at all. Usually they are held in contempt of court real quick, and they spend a certain amount of time in jail, and then they're brought back. Oh, okay, you ready to start making some sense now? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Man, whether he rejects the law of Christ or not, is still subject to it. And I know this isn't on this subject, but that includes God's marriage laws today, which are basically, as we many times put it, one man for one woman for life. There is one exception that he allows, and that is for the fornication of one of the spouses. Then the one who has not committed fornication can put that fornicator away with the right of marrying someone else. Yeah, that's simple. But that's the law of Christ. All people today, whether they recognize it or not, are subject to it. Because it is a universal kingdom. And it is spiritual in the fact that we live according to the Spirit. We are to be producing the fruit of the Spirit within our life, walking according to the Spirit. That is the Spirit's instructions as revealed in that New Testament. So the two laws. And we're not going to get very far on this one, because the timekeeper is back there about to ring the second bell, so I'm not even going to try and start. Any questions, comments before we end the lesson this evening? If not, then we'll begin there, Lord willing, next time.